with GoToWebinar, and I'm hoping you haven't had those issues also in trying to get online. But we're away now, so I'm hoping that that whatever issues we have had with, for instance, throwing the organiser of the event out of GoToWebinar, I'm hoping they're behind us now, and that we can move forward. What I've done so far, guys, is to show you my screen, and I'm hoping that you can actually see our beginning slide here, which is of a couple of different types of crops, and I'll get to why I've chosen that picture in just a moment. But what I first want to do is give you the opportunity to just, if this does happen to be your first webinar experience, I want to give you the quick nutshell version of how to participate in the GoToWebinar webinar. And what you should have on your screen at the moment is a control panel. And so on that control panel, you perhaps see other people who are showing up in the webinar, but you'll also notice a couple of key features that allow you to interact today. Number one is that we've got a hand up option. So you'll see a little hand there. And what you can do with that hand is you can put it up just like you're in a classroom, and I'll pay attention to you at that point. And you can also put it down again once your point has been made and you've had your opportunity to say something. So while our webinar that we ran last month was about individual behaviour plans, and we wanted to make sure that we, I guess, got through the content of the webinar, and that we got through it with some sort of detail and made sure that we didn't leave any bits and pieces out. Today's topic is a very different topic. So it's a topic where you might have an issue that you think is pertinent to raise at a particular time, as we touch on an aspect of that ethereal stuff, I guess, that is a school culture. And if that's the case and you'd like to be able to contribute to the webinar and contribute your audio and to ask a question or to make a comment, then just pop that hand up and I'll keep an eye out. And if I can do that, I'll make sure we get an opportunity to unmute you, which I can do from the central control panel here, and we can get that question from you as we go. So I very much encourage you to be interactive about our webinar today and to put your hand up if you like as well. I'm going to try and skip through things today, and that will hopefully also facilitate some opportunity for questions at the end, so people will also get the opportunity to be encouraged about putting your hand up at the end of the webinar. And I'm going to quite deliberately try and leave some time for that. You'll also notice that there's a question box too. So if you go to that question box and pop your question in there, then we're hoping that I'll be able to see those questions, and that at some stage during the webinar, you'll be able to, I'll address that question as quickly as I can. If not, I'll get to it when we get right to the very end. So 2 ways that you can get involved in the webinar today. Number one is to put your hand up and have something to say or something to ask. And the second one is to pop a question in that question box, and I'll address those on the run if we can, if not at the very end. The other thing I wanted to mention today is that we are recording this webinar, so you'll be sent a follow-up email in the next day or two that will provide you a link to be able to view the webinar again. So if you happen to, if you're absolutely desperately called away from the desk or something like that this afternoon and you can't stay for all of the webinar, or if you think it's a valuable experience and there are other people in your school who you think might benefit, then you've got that chance to. We'll upload this webinar to YouTube, and you'll be able to have a look at it with a colleague, or perhaps be able to distribute it around your school. This isn't, as you obviously very well know, this is a free event, and this is something that we're not trying to keep private. We really want all schools to be able to benefit from the thinking behind what it takes to build a successful school culture, and indeed why you should. One question that you might be asking is why you should be listening to me around school culture. And I guess that my journey in a very small nutshell is after a few years of working in behaviour and wellbeing in schools, and working extensively as a teacher in primary, special and secondary settings, I found myself as a principal in the Northern Territory, and spent a few years there, and then I founded Real Schools at the start of 2012. So we've been going for a bit over 2.5 years now, and Real Schools is built very much on both the experience that I had of trying to build successful school cultures, and also the research that I've done in preparing to be able to build school cultures. And that was very much brought home to me when I had a wonderful opportunity to open a new school, and I'll tell you a little bit about that shortly. So first of all, let's have a look at this opening slide. I think this is my favourite picture when it comes to school culture, which may seem like a really odd picture, because I guess what I'm trying to emphasise for you here is when we ask ourselves what a school culture is, I think it's about tending to the soil rather than planting a new crop. And so when we look at the difference between the two crops that we have on the screen here, when we look on the left, I think we can get a distinct feeling that but the farmer on the left as well as the farmer on the right have probably planted exactly the same crop. But we get a feeling that the farmer on the left has paid less time to the soil and making sure that the soil was ready for that crop than the farmer on the right. And so while the seed that they planted might have been, even bought from exactly the same place, it's where they've planted that seed that has been the fundamental difference in whether they get positive growth or not, whether the things that they're trying to grow are growing successfully or not. And I think that when you're thinking about school culture, that's exactly what you're doing, is you're thinking about the soil in which you are planting your crops. Now, we're not planting crops in schools, but we are certainly planting programs all the time. We're planting new whole school approaches. We're planting pedagogical improvements amongst our teachers. We're planting our own instructional leadership. And if we don't plant out those programs in an environment in which they have the possibility to grow, then we find that they become quite unsuccessful, and they just don't produce the bounty that we were certainly hoping that they would. And I think this is the fundamental reason that we end up with wild and wide disparaging views about certain programs. So you might bring in even a literacy program to your school because a school down the road has had such wild and wonderful success with it, and then you find it just doesn't take off in your school, and we end up with half of the community saying that it's a great program and half of the community saying it's a terrible program. And it's not the community at all. It's the culture or the environment or the climate in which we decide to plant that program that has all of the impact on how successful we are. So what we're really on about today is keeping ourselves on the right side of the screen, and we want to make sure that we're going to tend to the soil today. And that means that what we're on about when we're talking about school culture is that we're not trying to talk about what we do anymore. We're trying to talk, when we're thinking culturally, about how we do it. And I guess I couldn't have had a better experience for that than the opportunity to open that new school that I mentioned before at Rosebery Primary School. I'm just trying to get the screen to change now. There we go. So when we talk about crops, this is my crop. And this was the last, day job that I had before I opened real schools. And this was day one at Rosebery Primary School when we opened a brand new school. We had about 350 students arrive, and about 300 it was on day one. And they came from, we counted at one stage, from 36 different schools. And we had about 26 teachers there on day one who came from 25 different schools. So getting everyone on the same page was going to be a monumental challenge. And it became abundantly clear to me that wasn't about what I decided to do. It wasn't about what programs I decided to bring in, but it was certainly about how I did things. And as I approached the assembly this morning, one of my favourite stories from my time at Rosebery was that what I realised was at this moment, as I took this photo, I was about to walk in front of an assembly that was students milling together for the first day of a brand new school. And I was going to say good morning to them exactly the same way that every other principal says good morning. So I was going to say good morning, and I was going to expect the usual sombre good morning where you present your eyebrows, lower your voice, slow your voice, and give a very downtrodden good morning, Mr. Voigt. And I just thought, I'm not quite sure that that's the perfect way to open a new school. So we changed the way we said good morning, and I said, I'm going to say good morning in an excited and enthusiastic voice, and then I'm going to clap twice. So I said, good morning, everyone. And I expected everybody there to be able to say good morning back to me and to clap twice with lots of enthusiasm and lots of excitement. And it just seemed a better way to kick off relationships. It seemed a better way to kick off a start. And I just thought it was a nice icebreaker for the first morning. What I found as I went on, and then after I opened real schools and I lived locally to Rosebery for another 12 months later, what I found was that nobody came up to me and congratulated me or spoke to me about what I did at the school. So that means that nobody came up to me and congratulated me on choosing the right literacy approach, and nobody thanked me for choosing the right technology. Nobody thanked me for choosing the right staff. Nobody thanked me for choosing the right sports equipment. But I certainly had students and parents and staff of the school sneak up behind me in supermarkets and say, good morning, Mr. Voigt. And it made me realise that what we're talking about here is the informal stuff is what contributes most successfully to culture. That's the informal stuff, and it's the work that we do relationally, and it's the work that we do repeatedly around relationships that will have the most significant impact on the culture that you're looking to develop. And so it's hugely important that we pay attention at that informal end. And that sounds quite a counterintuitive thing to do. How do we pay attention informally? And so what I've done is start to do a lot of work on how we can help schools to be able to create that culture and to have that informal focus that will allow them to be successful. And sometimes, as you can see here from the new slide that we're on here, that is one of my absolute favourite movies of all time, from the Castle. So the people who are joining the webinar today in Australia will probably be very, very aware of the Castle. And one of my favourite characters ever from a movie would be Dennis Denuto from the Castle. And I think sometimes when we're talking about culture, what we're doing is we're describing a vibe. We're describing what's the feel of the thing, and it's the and we say a lot of words like that because we're not quite sure what the language is that we're going to put around culture. As an example of that, I ask a lot of people, do you think the culture of your school is important, or how important do you think the culture is of your school? And everybody, to a person around Australia tells me, yes, it's extremely important. And then sometimes I get a bit cheeky and I ask, well, what is a culture? And people start to sound a little like Dennis Denuto. And we do a little bit of, it's the vibe of the thing. It's the feel of the place. And I would contend to you that we need to start to think a little bit more concisely and a little bit more specifically around what our culture is, being able to describe it, being able to get a handle on where we're starting from when we're looking to build and cultivate and enhance a successful culture. So what I want you to do is to start doing that today. So what I am going to do right now is I'm going to launch a poll. I'm going to ask you, in just a moment, to have a look at some statements around school culture. And I want you to have just a little think for a moment about which of these statements best describes the school culture that you currently have at your school. They might not describe it perfectly, but of the statements that I put in front of you, which one do you think is going to best describe the culture that you're in? So one where we're struggling a bit and relationships and cohesion are an issue, or is it that we get along but that we're lacking a bit of purpose, or we've got purpose but there's that lack of team effort? Or is it that we're doing well, but there's another level that we can get to and we're not quite sure how to do that? Or is it that you really believe we have a strong, clear and focused and relational school culture that you can work on? So have a look at these statements now, and they should be coming up on your screen in just a moment. And let's get an idea of what our collective starting point is today for our attendees on the webinar. I'll give you about 20 seconds to give me an answer. Fabulous. We've nearly got everyone voted there now. And so I'll close that poll. And then we should be able to make sure that everybody can see the results. What we can see now is actually quite typical of what I experience when I talk to Australian schools. So we get a lot of people who say we're doing pretty well, and I guess the good part about that is that means that most Australian schools are doing pretty well. But we've got this feeling that there's another level that we could get to if we were able to think a little differently about what it is that we're going to add to our school. And indeed, anybody that's been in a school leadership role, and I'm making an assumption we've got some people in the audience today who either are school leaders or who are aspiring school leaders. Anybody who's been to a great professional learning event and then returned to their school and said, oh, I've got a fabulous idea about what we're going to do next, will experience that awful moment where everybody in the room, whether they're the leadership team or indeed the whole staff, will roll their eyes, because we've come to believe that the things that innovation and new ideas in a school, we've come to view those things as one more thing to do. And as I I'll explain and unpack in a minute, our teachers tend to be very, very tired of one more thing to do. They're looking for a different way to do the things that we are already holding them accountable to. So we've got that really strong story there of schools where we're doing okay, we're working really hard, and we're like the other schools around us, but we just can't work out how to get that exponential improvement that we're looking for along the line. And then we get people who are below that as well. I guess we get that group, that cohort that just go, you know what, we're struggling. Things just aren't working for us in our school. That can be a result of people being in the school for too long, or it can be a result of people being in the school for too short a time to be able to build that team stuff. And we get those interesting, that number 2 and 3 is a really interesting category where we get people who we get along pretty well, but, you know, we're not really achieving and our results don't tell us that we're doing something fantastic together. And then you get people who say, we know exactly what we're going to do, but everyone's exhausted and we're not quite sure, we don't get along all that well. And by particularly this time of term, we're sort of sometimes at each other's throats. And so there's some typical stories around those numbers in Australia. And I'm really pleased to, as much as there's work to do with all of those, because we haven't got anyone who's voted for, we have a strong, clear, focused and relational culture. But what we do have is a pretty typical outlay of what we see and seeing in schools around Australia. And so that gives us a fabulous starting point and gives me a really good idea of where we need to go next. Okay, so let's move on from Dennis. Like I said to you, what I'm talking about is about viewing school culture along something of a continuum. Now, the continuum that I consider here is that continuum that makes us think a little bit about the difference between an informal interaction and a formal interaction. Now, I want to unpack that a little bit further for you about what I mean by that, because what I would like us to do is to start to focus today at the informal end of this continuum rather than the formal. And I would contend to you that we've got a bit of a habit that we've developed over, only a few decades in Australian schools of focusing on the right-hand side of this screen at the formal. And I'll show you how we do that. One of the things that we can see here is that one of the, the icons or the artifacts of the way that we do this is that we tend to be very big on policy, but not quite so big on practice. So that means that one of the things we decide first is that we're going to write policy. And we hope that by writing a really strong policy at this end, that the influence of that will continue down the continuum and will start to be enacted in practice. And what we find is that there's a gap often between this. So often we end up with policies that have a certain ambitious flair about them, and what we're looking for also is to make sure that we have that policy reach the practice. And as a fantastic principal said to me once, it's extremely important that if it ain't happening in the classroom, it ain't happening. So there's very little point in having a policy written if it's not very much supported, enacted, and made accountable in the classroom. And that's through both the formal and the informal practice of our teachers. So hugely important to notice that there's a gap often between policy and practice, and that's where we get that situation where we've written a fabulous policy and then we save it on a server, and it gets very little airplay after that because we know that it's not being enacted in practice. So another way that happens that we get confused about this is that we get very program focused. So we look for an opportunity, for instance, to, even when we're looking about doing something around bullying, there are schools all around Australia who are buying and implementing bullying programs that deal with perhaps that deal with the explicit teaching of bullying to kids, all the way through to cyberbullying and bystander behaviour. We might have everyone in the school doing that on a Wednesday afternoon to make sure that the kids have got all of the facts at their disposal. But we're ignoring a large part of the week when we're only focusing on Wednesday afternoons. And so my contention to you is that we tend too much to plug in programs in much the same way that we might add an app to our iPhones. And we're thinking less about what actually is the iPhone that we're putting them on, which is our whole school approach. What's our approach to bullying? And one of the things that we forget about bullying, as an example, is that the number one research-proven protective factor against bullying in our schools is knowing something about each other. Yet we opt to buy an expensive program around getting rid of bullying, when what we really need to do is just find ways to informally, regularly, repeatedly bring people together. And isn't that interesting, even around that bullying topic, that our default mechanism around bullying has been for decades and decades to separate two people who have a bullying issue. And when the truth is that the thing that makes the biggest difference is to actually bring them together. And it's only when we can refer to something like that as a very consistent whole school approach, that we can really know that we're getting somewhere, and we know that we're actually deeply embedding something really important within our culture. Another thing that we do is we get really obsessed with the idea of writing mission statements. And sometimes we go through lengthy periods of time where we try to get the language right around what's the mission for our school, what's the one great sentence that we have for our school. And we're really doing that for sometimes just from a signage benefit. And we start to come up with our values, and many schools around Australia have values espoused. And I think that's all valuable. I think that's really great that we can do that we can put signs up about what's important, and that we might list our values. But unless people have them so top of mind that they can be referred to at every moment of the day, then we might be wasting our time there. And that is the difference between an espoused mission and an ethos. Now, the Greek meaning of the word ethos is everything we say and everything we do. So what I mean by that is that, is that if it ain't happening, if we've got a great sign written above our doorway as people enter the school, and that we've got our school is the friendliest school in Australia, and then as they walk through the school grounds, they start to hear the interactions between people that are decidedly unfriendly, then we're certainly going to miss the boat, and we're not going to be able to enact that mission in any way that's meaningful at all. So it's hugely important that we start to think about what is it that's evident in the way that we interact, and then how can we bring that to life through our mission. So we need to work a little bit in reverse if we want those mission statements to serve any purpose within our school. Sorry, guys, I'm just checking just the questions that we might have at the moment. I think we're under control. So we've got a question from you there, Brett, so I'll just put that one aside for the moment. And I'll address that one at the end. Brett, about numbers in the poll, I'll give you that one in a minute. Okay. So sometimes also we need to stop to think about the difference between culture and structure. So, oops, I just sort of get out of this. Back into the screen there. So what I mean by that is we start to think about we have meetings and we have conversations that are very focused on what's the timetable for the school, and we think a lot about the operational running of the school, but we don't have high level conversations about what's the feeling, the atmosphere, the relations, the student behaviour, the teacher behaviour that's on display in the school. And we need to try and make sure that we find a way to have structures in place that actually enact those cultural conversations. So it's asking ourselves the question of, do our leaders have agenda items that are about relationships in the school and are about the connections within the school, or are we very focused on building our strategic plans and our timetables and things like that? Okay, just going to go back. Back to this one here. One of my favourite sayings around culture is that it's hugely important that we focus on the difference between character and strategy. And I really like a quote that was presented to me that was made by Norman Schwarzkopf, where he said that leadership, in fact, is a combination of character and strategy. If you must be without one, be without the strategy. And unfortunately, I think in schools we spend a long time thinking about what is our strategy going to be, and we think less about what sort of character we're enacting and what sort of character it is that we are being defined for as leaders in our schools. So it's a difficult thing to do sometimes, and it takes a lot of reflective courage to be thinking about what sort of character it is that we're demonstrating. But if an American general, and I'm no American history buff or military buff, but if an American general whose strategy means that people live or die can believe that it's far more important who he is as a leader than what his strategy is, then I think there's something that for us to take from that, obviously from an incredibly high in an incredibly high pressure situation. So we want to make sure that we do have as much possible opportunity to reflect on character, because they're indeed the things that informally in car parks, around dinner tables, at barbecues, they're the things that people are using to define us, is the type of character that we are in our school. So it's really important to make sure that we give ourselves as leadership teams an opportunity to be able to reflect on that. A lot of schools end up with a large focus on meetings, and many teachers will tell us that their meetings are that they're over meetinged, and that there's a lot for them to think about, and a lot for them to attend, and a lot for them to get to, and a lot of these meetings they talk about are a drain on their time. And we need to just think a lot about these opportunities and how it is that teachers have come to view meetings as being so unproductive. And usually it's because there's a lack of dialogue in those meetings. So our meeting structures often tend to be quite rigid and quite traditional, with one person presenting and others receiving information. Whereas if we can look for opportunities to produce dialogue, and that can get down to doing simple little things like even setting meeting rooms up such that people are sitting cafe style in groups of 4, that can make a big difference, because it can provide small and informal opportunities for people to make sense of the information that's being presented to them, and give them the opportunity to be able to produce something from that information, as well as to be able to absorb it. We also fall for the trap sometimes around our professional learning of focusing on event participation. So we run events for our teachers in the hope that that will increase their capacity, whereas often the partnership with your professional learning providers that can make a really big difference. So it's hugely important to think about what's going to happen after, when you look to introduce something new in your school, what's going to happen down the track when your people hit a barrier, and when it becomes really difficult for them to be able to get through that barrier, because often that's when we hit those barriers and difficulties along the way, that's when we start to teachers will start to make decisions about programs and to label those programs as not being particularly effective. And mainly it's because they haven't had the expertise and the support to be able to get over that barrier. So it's hugely important to look for opportunities to implement in partnership with professional learning providers, as well as the opportunity to run a high quality event. And then often we get a little bit obsessed with the idea of outcome over process. So as we've been emerging through a period of outcomes-based education in Australia, it's hugely important to think about where people attach their value and where people attach even the concept of fairness to, and whether they feel like they're operating towards a fair outcome or a fair process. I often tell the little story that I always remember a group of students who came in after lunch that I was teaching, and they were a really fabulous group of kids, but they all of a sudden came back in very, very angry with each other. And I asked them what was going on, and eventually, reluctantly, they said to me that they were saying mean things to each other and quite disgusting things about each other's mothers. I asked them, well, that was no good, and there was a little bit of argy-bargy that came from that. And then when I asked them again, what was it that, how's this making people feel? And we started to find out that there were people who were angry and annoyed and sad about what had been said. And I said, what are we going to do about it? And one of my students said to me that he thought that we should, if we couldn't do the right thing at lunchtimes, we don't get lunchtimes. And another student said, ever. And there was only one person in the room panicking at that point, because there was another 6 weeks to go in that year, and I certainly wasn't keen on missing the last 30 lunchtimes of my school year. So I said, well, guys, how about we stay in tomorrow, and you can play a board game with the person who you've had a problem with, and then we'll give it another go the day after, which they agreed to. It was quite funny, because when I thought and reflected afterwards about the difference between process and outcome, I thought, can you imagine the response that I would have had from these year 5 and 6 students if I'd said, that's quite disgusting what you're saying about each other's mums. I don't think we'll have lunchtime for the rest of the year. And I think, as you'd agree, we'd probably have some sort of mutiny on our hands. It was the fact that they were asked, it was the fact that they were engaged, that allowed them to be able to feel like the process was fair and was certainly worth engaging with, and that the outcome that they were prepared to come up with was incredibly harsh. So we need to think a lot more about the process that we go through to make decisions in our schools and to set targets within our schools, as well as the idea of what it is to come up with a feasible and an aspirational outcome. And the next thing that happens is that we start to focus on bottom-up change processes and bottom-up change revolutions in our school rather than top-down. So rather than us as leaders in the school having to set the whole change agenda and to have to put ceilings on what can and can't be achieved, we start to put the tools in the hands of the people who need to enact the change, and then see what's possible. And we get what's called emergent phenomena in that situation, where we get, if you want to look a little bit further into emergent phenomena, have a look at some of Shigata Mitra's work with the hole-in-the-wall experiment. And what he does is work incredibly hard on the notion that what we need to do is learning will happen where there's interest. And if we can take that theory for working with the staffs in our school also, give them the tools, give them the knowledge that they need, and then see what they're capable of creating rather than just determining what needs to be achieved, then we can have some pretty fabulous stuff start to happen. So for me, I think that it's hugely important that we start to have a good think about why we should focus on that cultural element of leading and working in our schools. So for me, when I get back to what's the gist, what's the primary purpose of working in our schools, then for me it's about student learning outcomes. So with that being the case, what is it that we need to focus on to be able to get some sort of consistent, exponentially improving and enhancing data and outcomes around our student learning stuff? And quite clearly, even the work that's very much predominating, and rightly so, the work around Australian schools with John Hattie's Visible Learning program, quality teaching and the ability of our teachers to implement really great stuff is something that we're working very hard on. And I contend to you, though, that, like I mentioned before, if you come back with a great idea about the teaching in your school and what needs to happen, that you'll get some eye rolling. And it's because people will feel that along that plane of this graph here, that there's a huge amount to work on. And what we want to do is start to reduce that for people. So what is it that allows us to look along the school culture stat plane of this graph here? What is it that we can use to support that student learning outcome, such that the changes and the requirements that we have of people on the quality teaching space can make a difference? I would contend there's three things we need to think about. We need to think about the commitment of our teachers, and I'll unpack that a little bit more in just a moment. But what I am talking about here is not a commitment in time and effort, but what is the commitment that our teachers have in terms of a willingness to reflect on their practice? And what are the opportunities that they have to have dialogue around their practice and to do something with that? What is the capability of our students to care? And I get people all around Australia now telling me that there's a huge issue with students not caring in Australian schools, and their anecdotal evidence for that is that they tell us all the time. And so we're talking about how is it that we can enact within our students that switch and to turn it from not caring to caring, and how that can be manifested within their behaviour and with their engagement levels. And then also the idea of connected communities. And this for me is about how we can get parents and schools back on the same page. I ask people a lot what they think has changed the most in schools in the last 30 years. And for me, the thing that has changed the most in schools in the last 30 years is that 30 years ago, if you got in trouble with school, you got in trouble twice. And what that is a demonstration of is that there's been a corrosion in the partnership between home and school that we need to very much do something about. And for me, if we don't get these fundamental platforms supporting that student learning stuff by thinking culturally and thinking informally, then all of our ambitions around the quality teaching plane of this graph will ultimately fall down as people become tired and disconnected. So what do we mean by committed teachers? Like I said, it's about having teachers within your school who are willing to reflect, who are able to say yes with their hand up that they're not finished with this teaching caper, that they haven't been complete, they're not the masterpiece, and nor am I. And so there's opportunity for us to always sit down and focus on continual improvement and to think about how we can do better. There's a cultural issue that we have around teaching in Australia that we feel that we need to be right all the time. And it manifests at dinner parties for you guys when you're sitting around at dinner parties and people constantly ask you to spell words because you're a teacher and you should know. And for some reason, many of us still feel quite uncomfortable when people ask us to spell a word at a dinner party, because as teachers we feel we should be right, we should know, we should be finished. And that's not what the craft of teaching is about. It's about a willingness to step into being committed, and that's a commitment to reflect. My dear father always tells me that the difference between being involved and being committed is the same as the difference between bacon and eggs. And he says the chicken's involved, but the pig is committed. So we're often talking about trying to release the inner pig of the teachers in the schools where we're working. Like I said to you, it's very much around caring students, and that means that we want to develop, we're quite deliberately with that statement, we're not saying that we're talking about caring for students. We're talking about bringing about within our students the ability to care, to be responsible for their behaviour behaviour and to know that their behaviour and their engagement levels affect other people as well as themselves. So it's about the practice that we use that allows us to bring that to life, which is incredibly important. And then it's about that idea of connected communities. And I just love this quote by Robert Greenleaf, where he says that where there's not community, trust, respect, and ethical behaviour are very difficult for the young to learn and for the old to maintain. And I think that is very true and very reflective of the struggle that Australia, of the struggle. I'm just hearing that some people may not be able to hear me at the moment, so I'm just going to just see if I can get that audio right. Well, I'm going to persist here, guys. I'm just not quite sure that that we've got audio. If people can't hear me, then feel free to maybe let me know in the question box, and I'll have a look in there and see. See how we go. So what I might do here is just I'll address a couple of questions for a minute. Brett, we're looking at what numbers we have on the poll tab. We had 19 people participate on the poll there. Jeff, you've made a couple of comments here about not believing that we should artificially demarcate between things which should be complementary realities, e.g. mission statements should frame ethos, which would feed back into mission. Exactly right, Jeff, and that's why I view it as very much as along a continuum. So I believe there should be spread from one to the other rather than the two being separate entities. And one of the things we've raised here is the issue of dialogue versus monologue. And are we planning to seek some meaningful feedback during the session or just at the end? I'm going to keep an eye out, Jeff, and if you think there's something that's worth making a comment about, then please feel free to put your hand up, and I will jump. I will keep a very keen eye on there and see if there's a comment that we can take. But I'll also open up at the end to the opportunity for people to speak. So thank you very much for that. I'll continue to move on. For me, what I wanted to do in being able to get some focus around the way that I was building culture was to be able to make decisions reflective of the culture that I was trying to create. And I certainly found that one of the most difficult ways to be consistent in decision making is to try to be consistent. So one of the things that I did was start to build my own model. And the first part of the model for me was around anecdote. It was about understanding the people who were in my school and understanding the particular context and demographic of my school. So the people that you can see on the moment are the students at Ludmilla Primary School, where I was principal in Darwin. And many of these kids had not had the opportunity to get out of Darwin, in particular our Indigenous kids many who came from the Bagot community, and which was Darwin's biggest town camp for Aboriginal people. And so we tried to find a new way to change their story. And so we took them on a camp to Melbourne. And one of the things that happened when we were on that camp was that we thought that it would be incredibly valuable for them to be able to I'm just seeing some other questions. We've lost sound, can't hear. Does anyone else have sound problem? Okay, so we've got a sound problem. Just wanting to check here, guys. Could a couple of you, could you put your hand up for me if you can hear me? This stuff happens sometimes when we're running webinars, so perhaps if you can hear me, can you put a hand up for me for just a second? So I can see that Michael can hear me, Gillian can, Brooke can, Leah can, Brett can, okay, Laura can. So there's a few that are just struggling with sound at the moment. So I do apologise to people who can't hear me at the moment. So there must be some sort of issue at your end, but I hope that I hope that can sort of be resolved, and I'll keep an eye on those questions to see. Laura's telling me that sound's back, which is wonderful news. All right, so it seems we may have conquered a couple of technological audio demons there. So thank you very much to those people who are letting me know. So anecdote-wise is about taking into account the stories that people tell when they're in those informal environments. So what is it they talk about their school when they're around a barbecue or indeed a campfire, as it might be the case for these students. So we took them to Melbourne thinking that if they could see Bourke Street, if they could see that there were people who were in suits, that there was a bigger world out there for them, that would be a positive thing to do. And unfortunately, ultimately, while that might have been the case, we were certainly wrong to some extent, because for some of these kids, it was taking into account that you might be able to see a young Indigenous fella at the back of this photo in the middle that looks like he's pretty much asleep. And the impact on him was far more profound than seeing people in suits. The impact on this young student was that basically every day, by the time this photo was taken at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he either needed to vomit or he needed to sleep. Thus, the impact was of being able to of having 3 square meals a day and 8 hours sleep. Well, 8 hours sleep some nights. It was a school camp. The impact on him was so profound that it actually changed his body chemistry. And so we realised that sometimes when we're thinking about the experiences and the anecdotes and the tales that people tell, we need to be looking at how we can actually also impact the way that they live. And we found that to be a really positive experience for these students, was to just live a little differently. And it wasn't so much about where we had them at that particular time, although we certainly had some very excited kids when we took them to places like the MCG and the Eureka Towers. Did that type of thinking, thinking about our students and who they are and what their context is, what their background is, did that make a difference at Ludmilla Primary School? Well, let's look at the context there. When I arrived as principal there, we had the average years of teaching experience in our classrooms was around 3. We had about 50 to 60% of our students who were Indigenous, mainly from significantly disadvantaged homes. We had 30% of our kids who were defence families also, so there was some high transience and anxiety that comes along with that. And we had attachment to a literacy approach in the school that wasn't working particularly well for a large proportion of our students. Well, the outcomes that we got by thinking about who our people are and trying to match our practice to our cohort, Indigenous attendance rose significantly, and it sustained after the period, even when I left the school. Whole school attendance rose from above 91%, which means we needed no mandated attendance plan, which was very exciting for a school that had such a significant cohort of Indigenous students. We also managed to get all of our Indigenous students to participate in NAPLAN. Previously, that had only been at about 68%, and I guess you probably got a rough idea who the students were who were not attending, and they were certainly inclined to be our worst performers. But regardless, what we found was that our NAPLAN mean scores rose for Indigenous students in 10 out of 10 categories. And we also found that whole school NAPLAN scores rose in 9 out of 10 categories. And while I'm not here to tell you that NAPLAN is certainly the be-all and end-all, it's just one measure of student learning. And by this measure, we were able to really excite our teachers, as much as it was a challenge to get them not to look at the one whole school category that we didn't improve in. Year 5 writing dropped by a point, and they were very upset. What we did find outside that data is that our parent participation rates and our data around school stakeholder perception also increased dramatically. And so we really believed that we were on the right track as far as thinking anecdotally, thinking informally, but very much formally being able to prove that what we were doing makes a difference. Evidence was my second domain, but after anecdote, and that means we need to be able to prove our effectiveness. This is a group of students that we worked with at Bakewell Primary School in the Northern Territory who were exhibiting some pretty challenging behaviours, and in fact, the school there had some data that this group of boys were exhibiting about 6.8 aggressive behaviours every week in the school. They were very, very clued in about collecting data about what was happening with these students. We wanted to bring that down. So we implemented a program called Rock and Water, and that program has proven to be a really successful one in being able to teach particularly boys but also girls how to make smart decisions and strong decisions under pressure. We implemented that intervention, and we taught the boys Rock and Water for 1 hour a week for 10 weeks, and that 6.8 came down to 2.1 aggressive acts per week, and sustained for a further 12 months after we had run the program. So we're very excited to be able to prove our effectiveness. What did proving our effectiveness do for the program in the school? Well, it allowed us to be able to attract resource, and we were able to get some further funding to be able to run that program, and then we were able to have influence over other local schools who started to pick up the Rock and Water program too, which was really exciting. And then we need to use some intuition. And to be honest, I think this is an area that in Australian schools we've started to do less and less. We look for templates from outside when a lot of what our knowledge and experience that we have about building a successful school is ignored by us. And what we need to do is to use our intuition. I think that probably 30 years ago, this domain may have been about knowledge, and it was the job of the school leader to know the most about leading a successful school, whereas the job now is about taking that knowledge and applying it. And my contention would be that when we do it intuitively, what we're doing is taking that knowledge and using it to challenge convention and tradition. Sometimes that's difficult. We chose in one of my schools to challenge the way that homework was done in our schools, and we certainly didn't have no homework, but we adopted it, and we threw out some of the homework patterns in primary schools that were not making a difference. And so what we did was have a homework policy that was very much built around home reading and some automaticity stuff that was fun. And unfortunately, once everyone found out about it, we became front page news. Luckily, we were under a giant crocodile, which still to this day warms my heart about being on the front page of the NT News. But look, this made a really big mess for us, and we had a lot to deal with because we'd followed our intuition to challenge some convention and tradition. But I'm really delighted to report that while we did certainly bear some slings and arrows at this time, it's a policy that now stands in the school. It's a policy that's well supported by parents in the school, and it's a policy that's also now spread amongst local schools. So other schools have decided to pick this up now that ground has been broken. So I think that it's really important that in schools we're taking on the responsibility of not only doing a great job within our schools, but looking outside also and saying what is it that we can influence in our community? What is it that we can do in our industry that allows us to be influential, to be groundbreakers, and to make a really genuine difference? And so what it does for me is it allows me to have a model like this where I can say, okay, where am I? And some of you may have been able to guess that what I'm trying to do here is to act with some sort of balance and to get in the middle of this model. And so where I can know that, yes, my knowledge or my intuition tells me this is a good idea. I can prove my effectiveness. And yes, I believe that it's appropriate for the stories of the people in my context. And then it's about thinking about where am I? And some of you may be able to tell that my personal default is towards the anecdote. It's about thinking it's playing in that space where I love a story. I'm very motivated by a story. So it was hugely important for me to be able to say, okay, I need to make sure that I'm taking into account the other two domains to be able to make a difference. So what I thought I might do right now is give you the opportunity to jump in that question box again, and perhaps instead of telling me that I can't be heard, that one's stopped now. So I'm glad that we've got people who are saying that they can hear. Perhaps if you would you type in one word for me now, which would let me know which one of these domains do you think you practice within as a leader of culture in your school? Which is your favourite space? Mine's anecdote, so I need to be really wary of evidence and intuition. But if you would, grab your keyboard and just write in that question box for me. Write what's your word? Which is your domain that you tend to default to as a leader of culture? I'll give you just a moment to pop a word in there and let me know. We've got Leah who thinks she's into intuition, so is Riss. Okay, really glad to hear that. People who are big on knowledge, people who know what counts and like to challenge convention and tradition. Very interestingly, Gillian, Laura, Michael, Catherine, Eugenia, all telling me that intuition is their space. And this is often what we find, and I've run this activity with educators all over Australia, and we find that people, as school leaders, we tend to go to that knowledge or that intuition space. And that tends to be something that's a defining characteristic of leaders. You can imagine when I've run this activity with social workers in schools, they go to the anecdote space. And when I have run this activity with accountants, they go to the evidence space. And I'm very glad to have you here, Paul, because as somebody, as Paul's put in there about evidence, that means that we've got someone who's very important to us in our organisation if we were the makeshift leadership team, of saying that Paul would be a go-to person for us, who we know what it takes and we know what's really important as people who are motivated by intuition. But people like Paul will be able to tell us whether it's actually feasible to make it happen. So when I think about my time as a principal, while I felt that I was big on story, I could have a great idea. It was my administration and business manager who was big on evidence, who would say to me, just slow down for a second, Adam. Have you taken into account what percentage of your budget this new idea will take? Have you taken into account where this is going to fit in terms of strategic plan? Are you going to be able to prove that this idea makes a big difference? The people that we have around us who are who have a default towards other domains become very valuable. Unfortunately, we sometimes have a habit of building our leadership teams around people who are similar. And so what we need to do is to look for a healthy balance, look for people who can take that into account, and then also personally take into account that we need to lead in other ways apart from our own personal defaults if we're looking to make a difference. So what it's about for me is how can we, along this continuum, how can we flip it a little bit? How can we say, okay, instead of having a formal approach that drifts back towards the informal, how is it that we can start with the informal that has an influence on the formal as we move along? Because the whole of the continuum is important. I'm just asking you to look at it from a different perspective. Three of the things that I think make a big difference are teacher practice, thinking hard about what's the practice that our teachers use, the practice that we use as leaders, perhaps rather than the strategy. And then one that I've used that I think works incredibly well along this continuum is restorative practice. And I think that this can be a fabulous tool that you'd be able to use to be able to build a strong community and a strong culture around your learning community that is your school. If that sort of work is of interest to you, a Real Schools partnership might be interesting to you. I'm only going to cover this very, very quickly, guys. You can see that the themes that we use for Real Schools partnerships are that we build around that idea of cultural leadership, around leader practice. We build around behaviour management, which lends itself very strongly to that teacher practice idea. And then that idea of restorative practices is something that you might like to take on as a whole school approach rather than that plug-in program. We work with schools over 12, 24 and 36 months, and I'm really proud to find out now that we've got about 75 to 80% of our schools are now on elite 36-month partnerships that align with your review cycles and also give you the opportunity to, I guess, recognise that deeply held belief that if you're going to look to enhance, transform, cultivate or challenge a culture, that it takes time. And then what we bring in then for you is all of the support that allows you to do that. So we provide some really great high quality professional learning, and any of our partners will be available to you if you'd like to be able to find out a bit about the professional learning experience. We support your teachers in class. We tailor some mentoring towards your leadership team to make sure that you're supported to get that done. We make sure that you get targeted teacher coaching. So that means that when your teachers do hit a barrier 6 months after the professional learning, that we're there to work with them while they get that done. We make sure we run a parent information night. And today we've been recording some videos for our parent nights in our partner schools, where we provide a video that motivates your parents to come along. We provide you with the glossy flyer so there's not extra work for your school to do. And we underpin the change process with a lot of articles around teacher practice and cultural leadership. I'll give you a look at those in a minute, as well as provide webinars for our schools as well. Further, if you decide to jump on for an elite or an advanced partnership, you get unlimited phone and email support, which means that Real Schools has absolutely no intention of being a provider of professional learning to your school. We're interested in being a critical friend and being there with you and being accountable for the goals that you're trying to achieve as well. So one of the things you might consider if you're still sitting here going, where am I going to start, is that on the Real Schools website, there's a link under our leadership section that leads you to our Real Schools cultural survey. That'll take you about 15 minutes, and you'll answer about 60 multiple choice questions. And so as a result of answering those questions, we'll let you know in a detailed report whether your school tends to have a focus on anecdote, intuition or evidence, and indeed how that might lead you to thinking about where it is that you need to start in developing a school culture journey. So that's not something that's an absolutely free survey. So you can jump on and get that report for your school. And you can also make sure that within that report will provide you with some AITSL standards that you might like to address in moving forward in your school, regardless of whether you decide to work with Real Schools or not. The cultural leadership, I've just sort of lost that page for a moment there. The cultural leadership stuff, is very much underpinned by our membership service. Our membership service is $249 for 12 months, and it means that you'll get those 2 articles every month, and you also get a video every month that you can use as a staff meeting conversation starter, which is a very a great way to keep that operational agenda in check, and to make sure that we're also got a practice agenda in check as well. So really important to make sure that we keep that on the boil and at top of mind for people as they move forward. So what I wanted to do now is we do have about 6 or 7 minutes before we finish up for today. I believe that the sound may have taken a turn for the worse, but I'm going to hope that most people are hanging in there. So I am going to ask now, if there are any people who would like to ask a question, if you would like to put your hand up, or if you would like to pop that question in the question box now, we're going to directly address those questions as in those last few minutes. Or if there's any statement that you'd like to make, I'm certainly open to hearing from you about what it is that you would like to say about school culture. So I'll give a couple of minutes if there's anybody who would like to pop a hand up, or if you would like to pop a question in that question box. Some people are shy. Brett, I've got you there, Brett. There's a person with a hand up. So Brett, I'm going to unmute you now, and hoping that you're online. Brett, how are you?
Sorry, mate.
Have I got you, Brett?
No, you haven't.
Can you hear me, Brett?
I can.
You're great. I can hear you too. Fire away, mate. What's your question?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, I've got you, Brett.
Oh, sorry, mate. I was talking to myself, I thought. Mate, I was just tapping you a question there. In terms of school culture, I'm a deputy principal, and I guess my, not so much struggle, but frustration at times can be, does culture come from the senior management team? Does it come from everybody? Where does culture come from, I guess, is, if you've got a motivated leader and an inspirational leader, it's very easy to follow sort of where they're going. But yeah, as a sort of frustrated, sort of second tier level of leadership, does culture come from me or below that?
Yeah, I think when we are looking at that, I guess the horizontal plane of that graph that I showed earlier on, Brett, one of the things that's really important is that we need to think about the fact the work that's done culturally along that plane is very much done more collectively than it is on the quality teacher plane. On the quality teacher plane, it's about the work of individuals, whereas on the cultural plane, it's about the work that we collectively do. Now, the more involved, my experience has been that the more influential that you are as a leader, whether that's by title or just by practice that you use, it'll be very much around the informal interactions that those leaders have as to how they demonstrate culture. So as a result, what I guess an artifact of that might mean that, as a leader, you might go and have a chat to a teacher about performance, and that might be a formal performance conversation where we fill out a form and we set some targets and we address some issues. But it's the follow-up conversations that you have about, hey, was that okay for you? Or, what was that meeting like for you? Or how'd you go with goal number 1? Or is there anything I can do to give you a hand to get that second goal nutted out now? Or, you said in goal 3 that you'd like to go and see another teacher practice in a different year level and everything like that. Can I relieve you so you can do that? Now, they're all informal behaviours that maybe don't exist every time in schools, but the performance conversation where we fill out the form does. So it's schools that actually have leaders and leadership teams where they are mobilised to be able to have many of those small, informal, supportive, not necessarily unaccountable. They're often highly accountable conversations, but they're repeated and regular, and that's when it becomes a cultural icon of your school, that the people feel that it's a supported school. So it's very important for your leadership team as a group to have some conversations around that, about how they are informally supporting faculty, year level teams, whatever it is that they're looking to lead at that time, and how you can learn from each other about the craft of being able to mobilise people behind the vision that you have. Does that make sense, Brett?
Yeah, mate. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Brett. I'll mute you again. I'll just do a quick check. Have we got anyone else with a hand up at the moment? We've got a couple of comments from people. Leah saying culture as a whole is the whole school. Even the SSOs and the students can help each other. Absolutely. So thanks, Leah, for that, because what we're on about here is culture that is incredibly contagious. So what we find is that we really know that we're embedding, for instance, you might be looking to embed a relational culture through restorative practices. I always tell people that when you are using a restorative practice, you only know that you're getting it right when you hear it happening around corners. So that means that when it's happening in staff room around the corner when you're not there as a leader, when you're hearing students who are supporting each other using the training and the experiences that you've sheep dipped them in every single day, when you hear that happening around corners, that's when you really know that you're embedding deeply and culturally. Catherine's got a question here. She says, agree that the care factor is a big problem in schools today and the eroding of community partnership is huge. How can this be addressed? So I think this is a really interesting one. I think that what we're talking about here is addressing this one school at a time. I've come to believe that, I guess, Catherine, my poster child for who's the enemy of our schools in Australia would be Tracy Grimshaw, because I think that Tracy, through a current affair, has convinced all Australian schools that they can't trust families because they found a really crazy family who's wrecking a street. And she's also convinced families that they can't trust schools because we found a mad principal who banned handstands. And that's not what we should be connecting around. So I think one of the steps that we can take, Catherine, is to start to trust parents with the big information. So what I mean by that is what I think we need to do is to make sure that we communicate through our newsletters and through multiple channels about the idea that what we need to do is tell them about how we're building relationships, tell them about how we're doing teaching and learning, tell them about how we're resolving conflict in our schools, so that when those problems come, we can deal with it. If we're constantly just communicating with our parents about when sports day is, what's proper uniform, and when the canteen will be closed, then we can expect that they will think that we're up to something. And Leah makes a really good point, which is actually a fantastic place to finish, Leah, is to say that it has to be genuine. You know, we have to, like Norman Schwarzkopf said, it's all about our character, and we can't fake that. People will know. And so hugely important that we have to be really genuine about that if we want to move forward. So guys, look, I'm mindful of the fact that we've been going just about spot on an hour. Our next webinar is about succeeding with angry and aggressive students. We're going to send you a follow-up email that will provide you with the link to that. And then the last slide that I want to provide you with here is our contact details. If there's anything that you would like to talk to us about, whether if it's membership, just write the word membership in the question box this afternoon. If it's partnership, without obligation at all, just pop the word partnership in there. We'll get in touch with you and make that happen. But last things last, thanks for participating, everyone, and all the best with a fantastic end of term. Talk to you soon. Bye for now.